Greetings, everyone. Well, here we are, the final session of what has been a remarkable weekend celebrating the life and work of Ann and Sasha Shulgin. My name is Peter Maravellis, and I'm the events director at City Lights. On behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers, I'd like to welcome you to the 5th session of our celebration entitled Towards a Sane and Healthy Future. This event is being presented by City Lights in conjunction with Transform Press and Synergetic Press as we inaugurate the release of their new book, The Nature of Drugs, History, Pharmacology, and Social Impact. This is the first in a 2-volume set of writings based upon the lectures of the late Alexander Sasha Shulgin, recorded at San Francisco State University in the late 80s. Intended to be taught as an introductory course on drugs and biochemistry, this transcription is a unique document, being both a historic record of Alexander Shulgin's teaching style and the culmination of his philosophy on drugs, psychopharmacology, states of consciousness, and the societal and individual freedoms related to the use of psychoactive substances. As we begin this session, I'd like to acknowledge that this is an event that's being broadcast from the site of the ancestral homelands of the Mu'ukma Ohlone peoples. I'd like to begin our final session with a moment of silence to stand in recognition of the place that we occupy. A few thank yous need to go out to our co-sponsors. They are organizations that are at the forefront of pharmacological advocacy and research. A spirited thanks to the Beckley Foundation, the California Institute of Integral Studies, the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines, the Arrowwood Center, the Fireside Project, Lucid News, the McKenna Academy, our friends at MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, the Psychedelic Sangha, the Psychedelic Society of San Francisco, as well as that of the UK, Psychedelic Seminars, Psychedelics Today, the USONA Institute, and of course the City Lights Foundation, which is carrying on the legacy of our late founder, Lawrence Ferlinghetti. As you can see, there are so many people that have come together. This is such an immense community, and the goodwill that has taken place over the course of the last 2 days, it's palpable. You can really feel it. And I personally have been deeply moved by what I have experienced. So this program could never have been realized with all of these people coming together in the way that they did. But I do have a huge debt to kind of bow to. The Transform Press and Synergetic Press have performed an amazing service. And I'd like to also pay our respects to Ann Shulgin and Wendy Tucker for carrying on the legacy of the Shulgin work. They've managed this vast repository of really important data. And this collaboration with Synergetic Press continues their commitment to the research conducted by Ann and Sasha, and the mentorship they offered to many gifted researchers that continue this important work. So a huge thank you to Deborah Parrish-Snyder, the co-owner and publisher of Synergetic Press. Synergetic Press are based in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and for over 30 years have been publishing unique and paradigm-shifting books on the environment, ethnobotany, psychedelics, consciousness, and cultural anthropology. City Lights is honored to be working with them once again, as we've collaborated before on numerous events. A special thanks go out to Sandy Balin, Doug Rail, and Jasmine Virda at Synergetic. Also to Amanda Muller, who's had the crucial role in the production of The Nature of Drugs. It's just such a gorgeous artifact, and so much of the effort that went into it, really. Kudos to her for that. So before we begin, I would like to let you know that we will be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase copies of The Nature of Drugs. We're also selling copies of PCall and TCall, the two great formularies and magnum opuses of Ann and Sasha Shulgin's work. I'd like to also take a moment to thank Jesse and his colleagues at Ozo Conferencing for producing one of the most delectable virtual environments for us to meet in. Actually, there will be one more opportunity, and that will be after this session. So for those of you lucky enough to enter this virtual Shulgin laboratory that they put together, you're in for a real treat. So I'll be posting links for how you can get into that. You may post your questions and comments for our speakers using the chat function as well on your Zoom dashboard. There's going to be a Q&A towards the end, so please do that. So our moderator for this session will be Mike Margolies. Mike Margolies is a psychedelic community catalyst and conversation creator. He is the founder of Psychedelic Seminars, an educational conversation series, and co-founder of the Crypto Psychedelic Summit. Mike started the Baltimore Psychedelic Society and has sparked and mentored similar groups around the world, from San Francisco to DC, all the way to Portugal. He has contributed to a number of other projects as an event and media producer, writer, connector, and advisor. It's a great honor to have him with us here today. He will kick off our final session and offer introductions for each of our speakers. Welcome.
Thanks, Peter. How's it going, everybody? It's really, it's an honor to be here. I'm actually broadcasting live from the Shulgin farm right now, which is really quite a privilege to do. Anna's sitting here with me. We'll bring her on later, and a whole bunch of other folks that are here. The segment here is going to be actually two parts. The first 75 minutes or so, I'll be here with Julie and Bob and Michael, and then we'll do a little transition and bring on the folks that are here physically with me at the farm and do a second roundtable, all roundtable format. We're all going to be bouncing off each other, engaging conversationally. So for folks who don't know the panelists here, you probably know at least some of them. So Michael Pollan is the multi-time New York Times bestselling author, most recently of How to Change Your Mind, what the new, here, let me get the full subtitle here. What the New Science of Psychedelics teaches us about consciousness, dying, addiction, depression, and transcendence. And he's got a new book coming out, This Is Your Mind on Plants, coming out in like a week or so. So look out for that. We've got Bob Jesse, who is the subject of chapter 1 of Michael's book, actually. So Bob has been behind the scenes doing a lot of the work of moving this psychedelic renaissance forward. He was instrumental in the Johns Hopkins group forming. We saw Bill Richards in the last session. So Bob sort of connected Bill and Roland Griffiths and got a lot of this research moving kind of in the background and brought us where we are today. He started the Council on Spiritual Practices, done a number of things in the community for years. And then we have, last but not least, Dr. Julie Holland, who's a psychiatrist, also an author of several books, and the host, one of the hosts of the Horizons Conference, which is coming back this year in December in New York. I'm very excited about Julie's most recent book, and let me make sure I get the full name of it right here too, is Good Chemistry, The Science of Connection from Soul to Psychedelics. And so I am really happy to have the three of you here with me today, and the topic here is towards a healthy and sane future. So I guess what I'll do is I'll just tee it off for whoever wants to answer this first thing. You know, we're talking in this conference in general about the legacy of Sasha and Ann Shulgin. So with that in mind, with this legacy in mind, and how things maybe have changed over the course of the last several decades to where we are today, the landscape's very different. And so based on where we're going, there's many potential futures, right? So how do we navigate, given what we can learn from everything Sasha and Ann have done, how can we navigate ourselves towards the best possible future, if you will, the healthiest and sanest? And whoever wants to grab it first.
Bob, you take this one.
I will throw out a topic and ask everyone to add to it.
Okay.
How about education, professional education and public education?
Okay.
Julie, go ahead.
Well, you know, first of all, I'm just as somebody who cares deeply about harm reduction, it is all about education, right? I mean, the more that we can teach people how to do things more or less safely, the better off we're all going to be. And so educating consumers, right, is very important. But then the other issue, obviously, is that we need to educate the treaters. This is a whole new sort of paradigm, you know, it really challenges the current paradigm of psychiatry. And in that way, I think psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is really disruptive technology. So if it's really going to be disruptive, a lot of things are going to have to change. And therapists are going to need to be trained in how to do this new kind of treatment. And what we're seeing now is a lot of different training programs, right? MAPS has a training program, USONA has one, Compass has one, Horizons has one, Fluence has one, CIIS, and I'm sure I'm skipping 4 or 5 others. So we're seeing a lot of people getting treated. A lot of treaters being educated about how to do the treatment, but they're all sort of different proprietary programs.
I like the term treaters. It sounds like Halloween.
There's some tricksters. We'll talk about them in a minute.
Okay. I mean, I think public education and education of individuals is going to be really, really important. We're entering, an uncharted territory, and it's a risky, potentially treacherous landscape. You're going to have lots of unqualified or poorly qualified people deciding that they are psychedelic therapists when they feel the safety of decriminalization, whether they should feel that safety or not. And then you're going to have lots of consumers, people seeking treatment, who are going to be facing this Wild West environment of, how do they qualify somebody as being experienced, as being good? So I think that, there's a lot to worry about. On the medicinal path, which is only one of the, I count maybe 3 paths toward normalization of psychedelics now. But on that FDA approved path, there are also questions. That Julie was getting at. When the FDA approves MDMA or psilocybin, which we all expect them to do in the next 2, 3, or 4 years, how are they going to do it? Are they actually going to attach requirements? From everything I know, they're very eager to just deal with the drug because that's what they're set up to do. They're not set up to regulate therapy. Yet therapy is very important to the success of what we call psychedelic assisted therapy. So there are tons of really interesting and challenging issues. And I think when Sasha Shulgin was around, the prospect of a big business forming around psychedelic therapy was, that must not have seemed real at all. And that's only happened in the last 3 years. It's, I think we have to, this is where public education becomes really important. That good, rigorous information is reaching as many people as possible, and that we have both experts and journalists who are bringing the news to people and holding the companies accountable. I think that's really, really important. That's a very important function of journalism in general. And given the Wild West of psychedelic capitalism as it's now forming, I think that becomes vitally important.
Did you want to add something, Bob, to that?
Michael, as you've pointed out, training for MDMA-assisted therapy is probably quite a lot different than training for the classic psychedelics. I know that at Hopkins, for a long time, the team there did not even call it psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, instead psychedelic-assisted therapy. And the reason is, during the session, there isn't actually any psychotherapy. There's no talk therapy, it's reassurance, a reminder about the flight instructions. But if somebody were to bolt upright and say, I just had a memory of my grandmother and I don't know what to make of it, the guide would not engage. So,
And you're describing psilocybin therapy then, right?
Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
With the classic psychedelics, at least at Hopkins, and on higher doses, psychotherapy is not taking place during the session. So it might be that in a way that's easier to train for. Where MDMA for PTSD, there is a protocol with a lot of training, teamwork, and attunement to know when to actually intervene with a patient or a client and when to leave them in their own space. So it might be that in some ways the classic psychedelics are going to be easier to train people for.
Well, the truth is that there are a lot of people who are already administering ketamine assisted therapy or ketamine assisted psychotherapy, who haven't undergone any training. So the truth is it's already sort of happening. And obviously we know that there are plenty of underground therapists who haven't I'm not going to question whatever their training is and whatever their education is, but at least we can say that there are people who are practicing who are underground therapists who haven't gone through one of these, sort of approved training programs that we have now. And I always sort of want to speak up for these underground therapists because I know many of them. And I think a lot of us know people who are really doing good work and aren't, board certified. And I think it's one of many questions is what's going to happen eventually when there is some sort of, governing body that decides that people need to be trained and need to be certified. And how do some of these people get sort of grandfathered in?
So
Well,
one of the first proving grounds for exactly that issue will be Oregon. Assuming that the federal government allows the Oregon program to proceed, and they do have the right to stop it, Oregon will need to figure out, how do we bring in so-called traditional therapists whose training might be with an indigenous group? How do we
Right.
bring in people who are working in a Western modality, have been doing so for decades, but they're not licensed? And I think it's going to be a really tough problem to solve because no matter where you draw the line, people will argue that it should be a little different. You're including too many people, you're excluding too many people.
Yeah. Well, this brings up this whole issue. It's coming up in the chat of when we're doing clinical research and when you're running a protocol, you are really trying to limit how many variables you have. Like even with MAPS, they have sort of a manualized way of doing the therapy so that there's not a lot of variability. And obviously in the research, we're excluding tons of people. If anybody's got a history of psychosis or a first degree relative with a history of psychosis, you can't be in the study. If you've got, sort of unchecked hypertension, high blood pressure, you can't be in the study. So a lot of people are getting screened out. But when it's not research anymore, and when it's just a treatment, what sort of exclusions are we going to make? And then you can really not worry so much about the variables and really sort of titrate it more toward the customer or the patient or the client, who's having the experience and what do they really need.
I think an interesting question too, while we're talking about guides, is whether this is going to be regulated by the state of Oregon or some other body, or whether maybe it works more like a profession, like a bar association or something, and that there is a private group that sets standards, basically punishes people who fuck up and or excludes them, but gives the public some sense of assurance that these people have been in some way vetted. It seems crazy to train a highly experienced underground therapist, but there might be ways to assess their experience, give them, credit for life experience, as happens in architecture, for example. You can take a test, over X days, very rigorous test, or you can put in a certain number of hours as an apprentice. So there may be, I think we have to think outside the box because as Julie points out, this is a strange problem. We have some very green people who pass through CIIS who don't have a lot of experience, and yet they're more credentialed than people who have decades of experience.
Yeah.
And there seems like something unfair about that.
So, but I do feel like compared to a lot of the things to worry about, that's pretty low on the list. You alluded, Michael, to sort of people behaving badly, and what do we do about them? And, I think that sort of bumps the list a little bit. Is right now, I think we've been really lucky that there haven't been too many terrible disasters. I hear about some real problems in the sort of toad medicine 5-MeO community, just egregious things going on. But that's something, I jokingly refer to this as shamans behaving badly. But it really has a potential to be a big problem. And I mean, there are psychiatrists, like, forget the psychedelics. There are psychiatrists who and therapists who have issues with boundaries, and really weird relationships come up. And even without the drugs being involved, there are sometimes people who really overstep or misstep. And so I just think we need to watch out for that.
On the errant shaman question,
Yeah.
it brings up again the importance of public education. If you're going to work with a guide or a therapist or a sitter, know that person. Ask for references. Ask if there's somebody you can complain to if you think they're not doing a good job, whether that's a board at the state level, whether it's a private certification board, or whether it's simply their mentor. You could ask somebody, who's your elder? And can I talk to them?
Also, people need to know what to ask a guide and what to look for. If a guide doesn't ask you for your medical history, for example, that's a really bad sign. Some guides have really extensive questionnaires and then hand those over to MDs, consulting MDs. And then there are others who don't ask any questions. So yeah, I think an informed consumer, so how do you inform the consumer? Again, I agree with you entirely, it's education.
To an earlier point of yours, Michael, there is information now in the United States, an organization that plans to become a national certification board, which is a very complicated process. You kind of need to bootstrap yourself into a position of having people understand that you are qualified to be a certification board. And here's a fun little fact to know and tell. There's an organization in the US that certifies certification boards.
Nice. Good to know.
So, knock on wood, this is going to happen, but very much like what Oregon is faced with, it's going to be a lot of work.
Yeah, I really appreciate this emphasis on it, the education. Of course, my work's all been around public education with PsychSems, and more so on the public education side than training providers. But they're definitely interconnected, especially as we're talking about people knowing what to ask their providers. And I think I'll just kind of like echo some things that were shared here, in that the psychedelics are very different than other types of medicine that we have. Normally our culture thinks of medicine as something that just is a biochemical thing. You take the pill, it does the thing. Take two and call me in the morning. Whereas psychedelics, of course, there's an experience, and you're actually wanting a subjective experience to happen. That's sort of the mechanism, as I would argue, is the mechanism of psychedelic therapy, is you actually had an experience. And so it's a different kind of thing, and implies a different type of training. I would also say that we need to talk about community healing. And I have a little acronym I use called PEACH, which is Psychedelic Education and Community Healing. And I wrote an article, doubleblindmag.com/PEACH, where you can read a little bit about that. But there's a lot that was brought up here about certifications and what does the training look like. I would love to see apprenticeships happen, and actually have, ideally, the psychedelic guides and therapists and whatever word we want to use, actually having experience themselves with the medicines they're giving others. And that's not always the case. But then there's accountability was brought up here. And so there's a lot of interesting nuance. Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Oh, I wasn't meaning to jump in.
Oh, okay. Well, I can, if there's other reflections on this, happy to do it. I can also pivot to another point that was sort of alluded to. Michael, you mentioned the new phenomenon of the psychedelic capitalism. So there's a lot of money entering into this space. Yeah.
Great topic. Before we go there,
okay.
Another one. It has been pointed out that the Native American Church in this country has about 250,000 members, practicing members. There are other comparably maybe organized religious groups around ayahuasca with very much smaller numbers. Then the number of people who have been volunteers, participants in an above board research setting, that's rounding error. We can call it 0. And yet, according to government statistics, the number of people in this country who take a psychedelic for the first time every year is about 1 million. So most use is not in the doctor's office. And I've got this little hypothesis that even after MAPS trains up thousands of qualified MDMA psychotherapists, and other organizations train up psilocybin or other chemical therapists. Still, most use will be outside the doctor's office. It may or may not be medical in intention, but it will not be under conventional medical supervision. So what do we think about that? What's good about it? What's bad about it? How can we make it better? I think it's inevitable.
Well, I think you have to think about dose also, though. I mean, I run into people all the time who've had very powerful and positive experiences using psychedelics on their own or with friends. And that's part of the scene without a question. But I think that the kinds of doses we're talking about, these therapeutic doses, call for more care. And again, that's an education issue. I think people have to be informed about how to approach it. I think that in general, we have a lot to learn from, I'm glad you brought up the Native American Church, from indigenous uses of psychedelics. I mean, one of the interesting things about the phenomenon is when psychedelics came to the West, beginning in the 50s and 60s, they arrived without instructions. And people kind of tried to figure it out on their own. And they did some really cool things and they did some reckless things. They thought it was cool to spike a punch bowl. We didn't know this powerful new force, what we were dealing with. And there was an instruction manual available, but very few people were aware of it. And that was how indigenous cultures in South America and the Native American Church were using them. And there's certain lessons to be drawn from these very successful applications. And Andrew Weil kind of drew them really brilliantly in his first book, The Natural Mind, which I encourage everybody to read. He was 28 when he wrote it, but he'd spent time already in the Amazon and was familiar with a lot of traditional uses of psychedelics. And he pointed out that drugs that are used in a ritual way, that ritual is protective in and of itself. Rituals are a set of manners and mores in a way that govern how you approach something. And he pointed out that people who use drugs ritually, and this goes for alcohol as much as psychedelics, are much less likely to get in trouble with them. And but there are other aspects of indigenous use too that we have a lot to learn from. The fact there is usually an elder involved in some way, somebody who knows the territory, that they're often taken in a group, and that they're always approached with reverence and with a sense of intention. And these values apply to people working outside any institutional setup. You can bring those qualities to bear on the experience, and I think if you do, you're much more likely to have a good experience.
Well, I think everything you said is true, Michael, but I guess one of the things Bob is sort of alluding to is that there are plenty of people who are just tripping balls with their friends and rolling around in a lawn somewhere and giggling, and maybe they're still maybe they still have gotten something positive from that or therapeutic from that. It's true that that the amount of people who have had an experience within clinical research versus on their own, it's true, it may as well be zero. And one of the things I always sort of make a point of saying is that I really think that this dichotomy between recreational use and therapeutic use is like many things, it's a false dichotomy. It's really a spectrum. It's easy enough to have a recreational experience that you end up finding therapeutic. And also this issue of the drug's effect, even if you don't maybe, have a mystical experience, you're still taking something that is sort of a plasticogen, that enables a neuroplastic state where you're going to have some things changing in your brain. And there are parts of your brain that are going to kind of communicate with each other that usually don't. And there are parts that are taking up a lot of oxygen most of the time that are quieted. So those things are going to happen to some extent, whether you macrodose, microdose, whether you're in a great set and setting or not, a suboptimal set and setting. And the one more thing I want to say about education, and I like to focus on like this issue of destigmatization, you know, that the more we kind of normalize, look, this is something people do, a lot of people do it, and, you know, it's not terribly dangerous. There are certain safeguards we can put in place, but the more that we sort of normalize it or destigmatize it, the easier it's going to be for, you know, everybody keeps talking about integration, and how important integration is. But the truth is that we can help each other integrate if we have a community that normalizes this behavior. You know, the integration becomes much easier if you don't have to hide it, if you don't have shame around it, if it's not stigmatized. So that's something I'm really looking forward to. Is if your family, if you don't have to hide it from your partner, from your kids, from your family, from your parents, you already have like this built-in integration and support, you know, and sort of community support. So I don't know, I've been focusing a lot lately on this issue of like hiding and shame, and how it adds a lot of adrenaline, and it can make it end up being more addictive and more dangerous, you know. If you have to hide it and you have shame, then you can't ask questions and really get educated.
It's a
So
great point.
it's coming back to education again, you know, that it really is a key
Or
key
put
part of
another way,
things.
we're leaving, hopefully, we're leaving a world where important decisions about psychedelics were made by politics and by the law. And now they're going to be made by culture. And that's much richer, much more complicated. And
Yeah.
I think your point about community is very well taken. I think that lots of bad trips owe to the fact that you're doing something illegal, and you're doing something that could throw you in jail. So I think that we're moving out of this drug war phase, and I may be unduly optimistic. And now we're trying to figure out what the peace looks like. And as is often the case after war, that's a lot more complicated. And but these are cultural questions, and that's the exciting project before us in the next few years, is figuring out what is a healthy culture of psychedelics.
I'll mention here what Paul Daley has mentioned at least twice throughout the weekend, which is Huxley's book Island. Not acclaimed as his best literary work, but his widow said it was his most important work. And I appreciate it because it illustrates a culture that has solved the problem you just stated, Michael. And the psychedelic medicine is actually not used very often. It's mainly used as a rite of passage.
That's so interesting. Bob, you've been encouraging me to read that book for a long time.
You're gonna
and
get
I've
on it.
tried.
Uh-oh, really?
I can't get traction with it, but I'm going to try again.
Oh, the first couple pages are bewildering.
But you know, but also culture gives meaning to experiences, right? I mean, we all know, we've all perhaps had this experience of having this powerful psychedelic experience in our youth, and not knowing how to interpret it, and it gets interpreted by the community, which are your other, you know, your friends who just, when you tell them you've had this experience of the divine, tell you you just took too much, you know, and that it's the drugs talking. It's never the drugs talking. And but if you're in a different community that is ascribing meaning to this experience, it's completely different.
Well, you know, Maria Mangini just made a great comment in the chat, and she said that really community is like one of the casualties of the drug war. You know, that because it's illegal and you have to hide it, you don't get to make a community.
Unless you're very careful.
Great.
Well, we do end up making communities, but it is shaped, you know, by the prohibition to some degree.
Maria mentioned yesterday during the panel she moderated, Betty Eisner, who is one of the departed important elders of the psychedelic world,
Yeah.
who introduced the notion, I hope I get it close to correct, it's not only drug, set, and setting, it's drug, set, setting, and matrix. And by matrix, she meant community and culture and the narratives that are carried by the culture. So, yay that the culture is evolving. I hope the narratives are getting more skillful.
Well, that's why storytelling becomes important too. Sharing stories, hearing stories, it's all about building a richer context in which these experiences can take place, whether they're guided or unguided.
Could I add one more thing about education? Um, it has been common in the drug policy reform world, and especially the psychedelic drug policy reform world, to emphasize how safe the psychedelics are. And it leads to statements like, the safest among all the recreational psychoactive drugs. And you can find charts and ethnographic studies and government statistics that say alcohol is the worst and psilocybin is the least worst or the safest. I think it's time for that narrative to get a little bit more sophisticated. There was a death in California maybe 3 years ago. A man in his 70s, thought to be generally very healthy, who was working with a guide and died with some cardiac event. And there's a fear among the research community and beyond the research community that events like that, especially ones that are way more dramatic, as if that isn't tragic enough, could really arrest the FDA track and progress at lessening inappropriate laws. So back when that happened 3 years ago, I did some number 2 pencil work and tried to figure out what is the base rate of serious adverse events, particularly death, among people who take a classic psychedelic. And I don't really have the tools to wrap my arms around it, but we'll say, 1 in 500,000, 1 in a million, 1 in a couple million. And unfortunately, human brains don't deal with small probabilities very, very well, very accurately. So when there will be another tragedy, because there will be another tragedy, instead of somebody saying, I tell you all those psychedelics were terrible, we're on a totally wrong track, undo Oregon, make them illegal again, I think we want people to understand that in any activity, there are accidents and tragedies. It's true of rock climbing, and name 10,000 other activities.
Yeah, but as you said, the human brain doesn't work that way, and certain narratives exist in the culture around psychedelics that they're particularly risky, and going back to horror stories from the 60s, and so that let's take a suicide in research trials for depression, right? I mean, there's a good chance that if you trial 1,000, 2,000 people who are have treatment-resistant depression, somebody's going to commit suicide in that group. But that suicide may be news in a way it wouldn't be in a trial of SSRIs, because it plugs into this narrative about psychedelics. So it could lead to a big story and a big backlash. And there's so much magic attached to psychedelics, both positive and negative juju, that these stories could have real traction in the culture, even though they're, you're right, they're bound to happen, and they're to be expected. So I think that I don't know what you do about that exactly, except talk about it to inoculate the culture.
Bingo. It's a challenge to figure out how to inoculate the culture so that when there is a tragedy, because they will happen, they are happening, they do happen at a very low base rate, it's not so much of a shock. Somebody died in a car crash. That's a tragedy. But we don't rethink our relationship to cars very much. And I agree, the human brain is not wired for it, but it's a big piece of public education. I myself am really watching how I use the word safe or safety or relatively safe, and want people to know that every once in a while something goes south, and very rarely badly south.
Yeah. Well, one thing I do is I divide up the toxicity and what is a physiological toxicity, and then what is a behavioral toxicity, right? I had a friend who was, you mentioned mountain climbing, rock climbing. I had a friend who was rock climbing, got high with some friends, just smoking pot, but he fell and broke his back. And that's behavioral toxicity, right? Obviously, cannabis doesn't break your back. The example I always give is if you're tripping and you cross the street, you may get very distracted by how beautiful the traffic lights are and you get hit by a cab. Mushrooms didn't, cause you bodily harm, but the behavior did. So there's behavioral toxicity. But you're speaking specifically of a physiological toxicity where there was some medical response.
No, I mean to include both. I mean to include anything that would be unduly alarming to somebody who did not really understand the complete statistical picture.
Yeah. You know, one thing I'm very worried about, and somebody's mentioning in the chat, is this sort of land rush in terms of ayahuasca retreat spaces. And, you know, one of the things about ayahuasca, and I don't mean to, well, I'm singling it out, but I could single out every drug. And, you know, this is the thing that's dangerous. The big issue with ayahuasca is really that it's not a medicine that mixes very well with other medicines. And if you're taking prescription medicines, there can be really dangerous interactions. And sometimes people aren't honest about what they're on, or they weren't screened very well. But this, I think that's one of the potential sort of medical issues. And then you have these cardiac issues with ibogaine, which I wish weren't there, but there really is something there that some small amount of people with ibogaine are having cardiac issues. And that is why, you know, MindMed is developing like 18MC, you know, that, or other people are developing these sort of ibogaine analogs to try to get around this cardiac issue. And, you know, there, somebody, I think, I don't remember if it was Michael or Bob, mentioned this idea of like them getting medical screening, people getting medical screening. But the truth is that there aren't that many MDs who are really hearing about cases of like, okay, well, this person wants to take psilocybin, but they're on these meds, or they want to take MDMA, they're on these meds. And, you know, it's one of the things that I do, and I really think that there need to be more people doing it, is helping to advise people. Sometimes, you know, because people are on meds, really the safest thing for them to do ends up being something like ketamine, because it does mix well with medicines. But if we are talking about dangers and risks, I think one of the things we really have to mention is this whole issue with drug interactions. You know, that a lot of people who are seekers and looking for these experiences are also people who are potentially on mood stabilizers or antidepressants. And they're, you know, some of these psychedelic experiences can be very destabilizing. That's the other thing, which is, you know, one of the reasons why, at least for now, all these studies are screening out people who have bipolar disorder. And I know that there are a lot of bipolar people, or people who have bipolar disorder, who would like to avail themselves, but it's really unclear. You know, there are certain people who are more at risk. You know, I mean, these medicines are potentially risky in some situations, and there's some people who are just have a higher risk. And, you know, again, it comes back to educating and letting some people know this, you know, this may not be a good choice for you.
We may also need to educate policymakers, though, too. I mean, that, you know, as these decriminalization bills or propositions take off in various places, some of them are silent on the fact that there are you know, indications certain kinds of people on certain kinds of drugs shouldn't be taking them, and that, you know, that doesn't always get addressed. Ibogaine is included, I think, in the California State Senate bill that was just passed as to be decriminalized, and there's not a word about the heart issues associated with ibogaine, or that you should probably get checked out before you mess around with that stuff.
Yeah. I have to stop looking at the chat, but somebody is questioning whether the phrase behavioral toxicity exists, and I promise you I didn't make it up. It's a real thing.
It does exist. It's a real phrase. And Earth Arrowwood has a preferred replacement, which I can't remember.
Okay.
But somebody will tell us.
I really love the emphasis here on like the education and community, and that's been the essence of all of my work, you know. And certainly all the research that's happened has moved the ball forward culturally, but you know, as we've gotten to here, it's not enough, right? We actually need the culture to hold this new thing, and so all of this conversation, this is so critical, the education and community, you know. And I mean, even just think about the problems in the world, you know. It's not, we can't just scale psilocybin to everyone with depression and scale MDMA to everyone who's experienced trauma. The point of psychedelics is to not treat symptoms, but root causes. So if we're just treating individuals in isolation that have trauma and depression, we're missing the point, because we're talking about systemic level issues that cause such widespread depression and trauma in the first place. So we have to do community healing. We can't just try to give psilocybin to as many people as possible to cure depression. It's not going to work. We have deeper issues. So I really appreciate this. And you know, to your point, you know, of course we want people to have access to who would feel comfortable, right, to a medical container or some other sort of structure. Like, as you were saying, Michael, the ritual is really it's so different doing MDMA in a therapy session versus at a party, though a party can also be therapeutic. We want people to have access to these safe containers, and at the same time acknowledge that most use does happen outside of those containers and recreationally. So what do we do about that? I think that is culture. That's where harm reduction comes into play. That's the education work, right? The education work of being honest about the benefits and the risks of psychedelics. As you're saying, Bob, we don't want to pretend, oh, these are just harmless. There's nothing that can possibly go wrong. No, let's just be honest. Let's be real. And this is actually a lot of what in the book, in the new book that came out, it's transcripts from Sasha's lectures. And he talks about this a lot in the book. I haven't read the whole thing yet, but flipping through it, he emphasizes that it's not about being pro-drugs or anti-drugs. It's about being honest. Let's be honest about the benefits and the risks. And that alone is a form of risk reduction. That is building culture and community, and resources that exist like Dance Safe, like Arrowhead, that was alluded to. These are all great resources for people who may choose to ideally, use psychedelics in a certain container, but let's have these resources also. So just
Fireside Project is another one. Mike, you're bringing up a couple of good points. I think, we're talking about trauma, and, the last book that I wrote about connection. I mean, the trauma is really a loss of connection to your own kind of authentic self, and recovery is about recovering that connection and like reconnecting to ourselves. But you talked about the community aspect, and, reconnecting to each other, or to nature or the spiritual plane, having more meaning in our lives. It all kind of comes back to connection and wholeness. But you're also you're alluding to sort of trying to treat the whole community. I think each person that gets sort of treated and has these reconnecting experiences, that helps to heal the community. But I mean, if you're talking about the sort of institutionalized racism and sexism and the other like oppressive systems that create inequitable conditions that lead to poor health. I mean, there are such.
Oh no.
Julie, your audio just went out.
Just for fun. There are these huge issues around how unhealthy we are individually, how unhealthy we are as a society. And I have huge hopes that things like MDMA and psilocybin and ayahuasca and ketamine and ibogaine and DMT and 5-MeO. I mean, I really hope that some of these things can help us reconnect with ourselves or with our families or our communities, and that we can start to tackle some of these really bigger issues about people who are marginalized, who need this medicine the most. How do we get it to them? How do we sort of find it? Enable this equitable access. Everybody's kind of talking about it, but I don't know how we're going to do it, and Michael, I mean, we all sort of alluded to this issue of like capitalism, psychedelic capitalism, and this like frothy market that's happening right now. I have seen so many decks. I mean, you said 3 years, Michael, but I feel like in the last 3 months, I've just like seen so many decks of so many companies, and very few of them. I can only think of like 2 who are saying like, we're going to take 10% and give it, we are going to donate to these marginalized people, or we're going to give money to these indigenous populations so that they can tell us what they need. Like, I think more people really have to be doing it. Just like add the tithing in, add the giving back right in. If you're charging a lot for a session, then it has to be that some of that money is actually going to somebody else's session who can't afford it.
Yeah, the problem with that model, and I think we're talking about the same company, is that investors didn't like that idea. Any kind of limit on their upside, and I think that they've had a lot of trouble raising money. But I think you're absolutely right. I think we have to be thinking about access. We have to be thinking of recognizing the indigenous roots of a lot of knowledge around psychedelics, and honoring that in some ways in these businesses. all very important. But, the best case for the capitalist approach is that if you go through the FDA and get these drugs approved and prove that you can deliver them efficiently, it will be covered by insurance, maybe someday by Medicaid. And that in our society, as imperfect as our system is, that is how we give access. And it's going to be, maybe MAPS will show another model for bringing a drug to market, but it takes a lot of capital to bring a drug to market and get it accepted as something that gets covered.
Well, I do think it would be lovely if insurance ever covers it. It really is going to take a lot of infrastructure, like developing, CPT codes and this. There's just no precedent for how to code this or how to get insurance to reimburse it. And obviously, I would like Medicare for all or just national health insurance. I will say, as a physician and a occasional patient, I really hate our current system and how separated it is and how proprietary it is. And we would have a lot more transparency and be able to share a lot more data. And we wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel every time somebody got sick if we just had one system. Everyone is in network because there's one network. And I want a pony.
Bingo. Most countries are sane. This one is maybe getting there slowly. On the question of CPT codes and insurance reimbursement, there's a new organization called Enthea, which is working to be the psychedelic insurance company or plan administrator. So these pieces are all getting worked on by people who care a lot.
Yeah, Leah Mix and Enthea, I know, is really trying to crack this nut, and I appreciate it. It's a big project, and I really hope that she is able to do it.
Yeah, I guess another thing I'll add to this too, if we're talking about access and we're talking about systemic issues, the big glaring thing here is, of course, the drug war. That, ending the drug war is a big step towards both getting people access as well as ending a lot of the trauma that we're trying to heal. So I would just put that out there as maybe a prerequisite to all this. And of course, we do want to make sure that people have access, not only just, as much of it not being a Wild West as possible, we want people to have access to safe containers. And I think ending the drug war, decriminalization broadly, is the first step towards being able to just have more conversations in the culture about what are some containers and what are containers that are even outside of medical models. What are other community types of containers that might be able to emerge if the threat of imprisonment were removed. So, I just think that's a real big glaring one that should always be named in psychedelic conversations, is the drug war. And open any comments on that. Also, folks who are in the chat, you can start leaving your questions. We're about 1 hour into the session, so we'd love to take your questions while we have a few more minutes with this particular panel before we swap out for the crew that's here live at the farm.
Somebody in the chat was saying that there's always been sort of a bifurcated thing where there's like above ground medical cannabis, but there's also underground, illicit market or whatever you want to call it. So they're saying, we'll end up being the same thing, that even if these psychedelics are FDA approved, and if there is some model for them being used in an above ground way, that there will still be underground use and people who aren't entering into that system. And I think that's obviously true.
But it's also important to note that underground can be very expensive, and it's gotten a lot more expensive because and that there is profiteering going on, and that there should be sliding scales, I think. In the same way that, if I get an MRI covered at UCSF, they charge my insurance company $10,000. So I'm buying a few MRIs for other people, I assume, I hope. I think that people who are charging thousands of dollars for a day of therapy hopefully are gifting it to other people, and that should be an ethic in the community. Certainly the sliding scale should be.
On the topic of psychedelic capitalism, May I read a passage from The Nature of Drugs, the subject book of our weekend?
Let's.
Um, I'm going to skip some phrases to make it flow a little more quickly. This is on pages 287 to 288. A student asks, so patents have a certain time? Sasha replies, they have a certain time. Darvan is a good example. It was patented about 20 years ago, and its patent expired 18 years later. You cannot renew, it becomes a public thing. But what often a company will do is say, we've got the name trademarked. You, meaning competitors, can't use the name. But what we'll do is find a gimmick that allows some new form, some new novel inventive change. In the case of Darvan, it was Darvan napsilate, or Darvan N. So they patented Darvan N, put a big advertising campaign out, and had another 18 years. So, patents are the lifeblood of a company. When a new drug comes out, you have a copycat approach throughout all of the industry. It is commonly thought that there are vast armies of researchers continually making entirely new compounds, and they're injecting them into battalions of test animals, looking for some response that will suggest a potential commercial drug. In truth, most of the synthetic effort is directed to modifying known drugs for purposes of patenting or of improving effectiveness and safety. So what stands out for me is his use of the word gimmick. And I can give you an example. It's not a psychedelic, and here I have sympathy for needing this gimmick. In Europe, there's an anti-anxiety drug called etifoxine, which has never been approved in the US. And that molecule is, way out of patentability. But to get it approved in the US, you need to do the full range of clinical trials. It's very expensive. So what did one of the Atai life sciences company do? They took the drug etifoxine, took out one of the hydrogens and put in a deuterium, which is hydrogen with an extra neutron, chemically almost identical. It can be expected that the clinical effects of the drug will be almost identical, maybe indistinguishable, but it lets them get a patent. So they're going to manufacture a more expensive drug with a more expensive process for a product that's probably about the same as etifoxine, because that's what you have to do in the United States. Can't make it legal any other way. I'm wearing a little button here. You probably can't read it. As much as I have sympathy for doing that with etifoxine, this little button says, grateful psychedelic exceptionalist. Ask me. I think that's fair game for a lot of drugs, but for the psychedelics, I have very mixed feelings about it, and many of them are uncomfortable.
So S-ketamine is a similar story, right? I mean, this is not a radically different compound. It's a new way of administering it, but it's the difference between charging $500 a dose or whatever it is and $5 a dose.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, and that's how our pharmaceutical industry works.
Or psilocybin, polymorph A, patented by Compass, in arbitrary changes to a molecule for purposes of getting a patent. It may be worth naming here, right? That this is all predicated on the story that we have that, well, the only way to get things legal is to get it through the FDA, which costs a lot of money. The only way to raise the money is to get investment money. The only way to get investment is to get a patent. And so there's this story that we have in our culture that the only possible way that we can get things to be accessible is to patent, get investment, and take it through the FDA, which may historically have been true. But I would actually invite all of us to now maybe think a little more broadly. Let's think about ending the drug war, like really ending the drug war. And if we actually end the drug war, maybe that becomes more of a moot point, right? So I would just invite that line of inquiry.
Well, there's this middle ground there, right? In this country, we have two nonprofits that are working to commercialize a drug through the FDA track on a nonprofit basis. MAPS is the best known example. It's going to take a lot more money, but Rick and company are quite determined to do that. And for psilocybin, there's Usona. Unless they fail, a psychedelic exceptionalist would say there's no reason to go down the commercial patent protected route, and you end up with something like S-ketamine for 600 to 900 a dose.
But I think that we're talking about enclosure in a way, people
Yes.
trying to control psychedelics. And I think it's going to be really hard. I mean, you have in place thousands of underground guides whose lives will be, with decriminalization, presumably made safer. You have this crazy mushroom that, is not that hard to grow and that can't be stopped. And so there are going to be several different psychedelic economies and serving different groups. And we haven't talked very much about these new churches, that there will be that container, to use your word, Mike, that we already have 3 that, churches in America that have the right to use psychedelics, and there will be dozens more. And, given the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court around religious liberty and the free exercise, it's going to be very hard. It's going to be an exploding cigar when these cases get to Sam Alito's desk, because the precedents are really going to argue strongly in favor of ensuring this right to use any sacrament they want.
After several years of stonewalling and deliberating, quite recently, the DEA turned down, finally, an application for a 3rd ayahuasca church. I will put a link to the article in the chat area. So
Is
that
the
particular
Shulgin article?
Correct.
Yeah.
So that path is going to be, it's going to take some time to iron it out.
And it'll be a struggle, but there are lawyers looking for exactly those cases, and finding the best case to take through the courts. And so it begins with those seizures and those refusals to acknowledge, and we should expect the DEA to do that when the Church of Lysergic Acid is established. But it's good, and it'll take decades, but it will happen.
So many pathways being pursued here. We've got a couple more minutes left for this particular roundtable here. I know we didn't get to too many questions from the audience, but before we transition to the second roundtable here, were there other thoughts that any of you wanted to add around, how do we move toward a sane and healthy future, in the context of the Shulgin legacy?
Mike, would you unpack PEACH again for us, please?
Yes, I can. Love to. PEACH stands for Psychedelic Education and Community Healing. And you can find a whole article I wrote about this on doubleblindmag.com/peach. And in summary, the brief synopsis is it's sort of highlighting the things that we are not, the cultural things we've been talking about throughout this conversation that we're not getting through just taking psychedelics through FDA trials, the education and community side of things that you don't get through the typical Western medical model, because, as we pointed out, most Western medicine is the kind of a biochemical thing. It's take 2 and call me in the morning approach, whereas the psychedelic mechanism is experiential medicine. So there's a level of education on both the part of people taking psychedelics and providers that you need, that we don't have in the and the FDA doesn't really quite understand this. Otherwise, I would think the FDA would have certainly made it a lot easier for psychedelic therapists to get their own experience, which they have not made. MAPS had to really fight for this and finally got an approval recently. So there's an education, and if it's not going to happen within the medical system by default, it's going to have to happen in communities. So that's one piece. And then the community healing is the other side of it. And that gets to the idea that we aren't in a vacuum. We can't just treat people with depression and PTSD as though they're just isolated individuals, but we need to work as communities and work on the deeper systemic problems. And so there's a much more detailed breakdown in that double-blind article, but that's sort of the synopsis.
The 5 words one more time, please, and then I'll tie them back to the Shulgins.
Great. So psychedelic education, I kind of cheated. The A stands for and, although I might put in advocacy there at some point. But in the article, it's psychedelic education and community healing. But maybe we can add advocacy there too as another A.
All right. So to the Shulgins. From my point of view, over a couple of decades now, Sasha and Ann had their heads out of the foxhole as community leaders. Their home was a nexus, a hub, Grand Central Station of all kinds of people coming through. And guess what happened? People got educated. And guess what happened? There was community healing. Guess what happened? If somebody was experimenting on their own or with a non-therapist friend and got into a little bit of trouble, phone calls could be made and backup was provided. I believe the Shulgins have modeled teach for us wonderfully during years when it was really hard to do and risky.
I would just add to that I was one of the people who came through that house and that garden and that
Me
laboratory
too.
and was educated.
Absolutely.
I'm very grateful for that.
Me too. And, as much as I went there to see Sasha and learn from Sasha, I really ended up at the feet of Ann. And it's funny because I think when I first met Ann, I think she's kind of the age I am now or a little bit older, but she was talking about a lot of perimenopausal stuff, but I was like in my early 20s and it meant nothing to me. It went over my head. And now I remember all those things she said now. And I'm like, thank you. It all came in handy eventually. But I'm really looking forward to what Ann has to say.
Yeah, and to this point on community, I think now that the world is sort of reopening some more, I think their physical community is really important, actually being in three-dimensional space with humans. And there's a really interesting thing happening actually now here in the Bay Area. There's a new psychedelic community center that has just opened.
Nice.
In the Bay, which is very
like the JCC.
like the JCC,
like a bad,
but like the
bad
PPC.
basketball team.
Yeah, right.
Speaking of JCC, Mike, I was just saying, if you can think of something that starts with S, like set and setting, then the acronym could be Pesach.
It could. We'll work on that actually.
You're welcome.
So yeah, I think this type of a physical community center like a JCC type model, actually I named that in the Peach article in Double Blind. I actually use that exact example of a
great.
JCC, and we have a model now in the East Bay, and people are asking, what is the psychedelic community center? It actually doesn't even have a name yet, because the community itself has been brought into the process of giving it a name, which has been really cool. But it's located right across from the Ashby BART, for people who are here in the Bay Area, at the old Terrace Temple location. If people know what that is, it's right on Ashby Road. I don't have the exact address on me, but if you're in the Bay Area and you subscribe to San Francisco Psychedelic Society, to PsychSems, email us, you'll hear more about it. There'll be a lot of community events happening, and I'm really
like that.
Yeah, and I'm very excited about the potential for this kind of thing. And the rent's paid, sponsored by Dr. Bronner's for the next 3 years. So there's
Great.
a lot of.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. And there's a lot that can happen in this kind of there's a home now. People can have free education, integration, community events for the next 3 years. And I think it's going to be a whole lot of things we can do there, right? We can have talks, and we can also do integration circles, but I'm excited to see actual, restorative, transformative justice. We talked about accountability for bad actors, and we can actually develop those processes in a physical community. There's conflicts in the community, and what does it look like to really resolve in a way that is not deferring to punishment models from the state to tell us how to do everything, but what if we in community do the accountability processes? So this is the kind of stuff I'm really, really excited for in the present day. And we're going to transition momentarily. I guess any final thoughts that any of the three of you wanted to give before we do that transition?
Well, I'm just thinking about New York starting one. We have so many hubs of companies now that are sort of claiming space in New York City. So I think it might be nice to have a center on our East Coast too.
I think it's the next level up of, there's psychedelic societies all over the world, which, by the way, if you go to psychsems.com/map, you can find your local community wherever you are as a resource and a whole directory of that. Or there's a Airtable version, a database version at psychedelic.community. So check that out too, if you're looking for community. And I think physical centers are the next phase of it. Imagine your first exposure to psychedelics, instead of being, in a waiting room, it could be in a tea house with community. That's kind of the vision of the future I'm interested in seeing.
Well, I would just underscore those two key C words, community and culture. And I think we're moving to a point, and this is a very hopeful statement because I'm guessing the drug war is running out of gas, and people are certainly suing for peace. I mean, in the last election and what's happened since, remarkable things are happening on the drug war front. But we're going to move to an era where the important things are taking place in civil society. There'll be a matter of culture and community. And so that's work for all of us, right? This isn't going to be expert led. This is going to be grassroots, and there's a role for all of us to play.
Amen.
Anything else you want to add, Bob? Okay. Well, if you're all feeling complete, we can start to transition to the folks that are here in a physical community right now, actually.
I want to see Ann.
Yeah, Ann's gonna come on the screen in a moment. We're gonna make a little bit of transition here. We gotta move cameras and rearrange ourselves here. But big thank you to all of you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Julie. It's been
My pleasure.
really great having you. Everyone see us now.
Yay.
Hello. We are here live at the Shulgin farm. So yeah, maybe we should go around and share. Of course, this is Ann here, the guest of honor. And we have Wendy and Paul and Keeper. I think some folks here you've already heard from. So, but maybe what you guys want to say? Yeah.
I think we've been introduced.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll turn to our guest of honor here. And
hi, I very much appreciate all the worship of the Shulgins, but I'm probably not going to have as much to say as some might want me to, because everybody else is expressing the ideas that I have and agree with. So you're going to hear more from the others than from me. But again, I appreciate the appreciation.
well, could I ask you some questions?
Sure.
Yeah, and actually, let us know if you guys can hear us okay. I'm going to put this mic over here. Hopefully you can hear Ann all right. I know one thing I would love to ask you about is, when all these psychedelics were first being synthesized, of course, the first thing you and Sasha did was you tried them yourselves.
Yeah.
We're entering into this era now where it is not required to take a psychedelic yourself to be a psychedelic therapist.
I think it's total nonsense. No, I think it's not just nonsense. It's dangerous. I think anyone who is going to give a psychedelic medicine to a client or a patient must know the territory, must have taken that same medicine herself or himself. To do otherwise is to potentially do a great deal of damage.
Thank you for saying that. I think that's an important point that has been lost somehow or another.
Yeah, it's vital. It's vitally important.
Are there other things that, based on everything that's emerging now in the new landscape, that are striking to you?
Yeah, what I understand of the Compass and organizations like that worry me terribly. And I hope that they're going to be prevented from doing what they're trying to do. Okay.
What would your vision be if you could really draw it out, a blank canvas of the ideal future psychedelics?
Oh, good. Well, it's pretty much what most of you would like. First of all, I agree with the war on drugs has got to stop. The entire emphasis on law has got to. The emphasis should be on medical use and spiritual growth. The laws must change, and we have to work very hard on making them change. I think it's beginning to, I'm very optimistic about the way things are going right now. I think that there is a great deal of hope. Okay.
No, that's great. I have a lot of optimism too. Do anyone have thoughts on going towards a healthy and sane future?
Well, I have one comment to add to what Ann had said about therapists needing to be experienced. It's sort of ludicrous that a person would want to be considered qualified for being a therapist when they were totally ignorant of what they're subjecting their patient to and the territory. I mean, there's a degree of pompousness in that that's actually frightening.
Yeah.
You know, the fact somebody would view that as even appropriate is really disturbing.
Well, the fact that is that to become a psychiatrist or a therapist, you have to go into therapy. You have to experience that yourself. So why wouldn't that be the model going forward with this, which is it's a bigger experience.
More intense, yeah.
Yeah, much more intense.
Or I even agree. even to be an aide at the blind school in Austin, you're required to be blind for a week, so you understand what your patients are experiencing or what your subjects are experiencing. And it really seems so basic, it's almost mind-boggling that it's being rejected.
Yeah.
I fully agree with that.
I imagine that would change, that prerequisite would change when things are decriminalized. It's probably part of why it's set up this way, but I would hope, because it does seem ridiculous to think that people could do this kind of work without knowing the territory.
Yeah, absolutely.
There has to be some education of the AMA in back of all of this, since there will be some involvement of that organization. So there has to be some lobbying.
When you're dealing with a spiritual experience, which is not the same as being sick with the flu. It has to be approached in a totally different way. And the particular needs of a person who's seeking spiritual growth are different. Okay.
Yeah. Another thing I'd love to hear from you. It's a little bit different topic, but it's related because it's, with the history of all this, if we think about how TCOL and PCOL and this new book came out, you were personally just instrumental in these even existing at all, and this documentation happening. And I'd love to hear you share a little bit more about how this documentation came to be, so that the people to come, can actually follow in that and document things for, the next generations.
Well, we had a research group, and the one rule was that after every session, everyone made notes of what had taken place, of what their experience had been. And the idea of writing a book, it was obvious that was the only way that everything that we had learned and were learning, and that our research group was learning, the only way to preserve it past the times of our deaths would be in print. And that is why we wrote the books. And so far it's worked, because the books are still selling, bless their hearts, 30 years later. And people are still learning from them, which is very gratifying.
If there's a bunch of young folks now getting involved in the psychedelic space as therapists or in drug policy reform, what would you advise to the young folks that are getting in?
Read as much as you can of all the good authors, and there are a great many good authors now. Read as much as you can, and get a good education. and get the diploma and aim for becoming a therapist, if that is what you feel you'd be good at. But go through the hoops that are necessary and do it properly.
Yeah, it goes to your credibility within society in general.
Absolutely.
You know, it's one thing to have credibility within this community, which can at times be a little insular.
Yeah.
But we have to think, I believe, about how we present ourselves to the world at large.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
Get those degrees.
Get those degrees, precisely.
Are there any stories you'd like to share that stick out to you?
I'll let other people do the stories.
I'm sure you have good ones.
Read the books.
Good point. Per your prior advice.
There are no casual experiments.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
good advice.
Yeah.
Stories. I think everyone in this group has stories.
Yeah.
Beside me.
Besides you.
I've already published mine.
Anything you left out?
Yeah. Those the things that were left out are going to be in future books that will be published by the Transform Press next year and the year after.
All right. So we've got more treats to come.
We do. We have a lot of stuff in the pipeline. I mean, a lot of that is due to the great work of Trout and other people who've been archiving. There's we're uncovering a lot of material that'll be amazing to publish. But the first couple of ones that are down the road are there's one that's a book of letters between the Stolaroffs and the Shulgins. And Anne worked on that quite a bit in the beginning of the pandemic. So she was very busy during COVID, very busy. She didn't stop working for a long time.
Yeah.
But that's going to be an amazing book when it comes out. And then we also have the third book in the series of P-Call and T-Call, which is, these are a little ways out. We're working on them. But Anne came up with the name Synergy.
No, synthesis.
Synthesis, I'm sorry. Synthesis.
My own dog.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. Doesn't roll off the tongue yet. Synthesis. And so that's being worked on now, as well as the second and third volume of Nature of Drugs, which is in process. And so it's, in fact, I want to give a great thanks to Trout and to Stacy Simone, who have been amazing working on these transcripts and put a lot of work into it. We're just finishing up volume 2, so we'll be ready to start getting that formed, this volume 2 of Nature of Drugs. And Stacy has been an amazing help to me for years now with Transform Press. She's also volunteered quite a bit here before when Sasha was getting ill and was starting to get dementia. So she's been an incredible help all the way around. And Trout, too, with all the great work you've been doing. It's been, I don't know what we would do without you, both of you. So, yeah, so there's some good things coming down the pipe. And then I don't even know what else.
Well, there's always volume 2 of the Shulgin Index,
yes,
which
the
is
volume
kind of a gleam in our eye at
That's
this point,
right.
but
Right.
definitely planned.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And on a lot of it, we don't actually know what all is there because there's such an immense wealth of material that it's unclear how it's going to emerge, but a lot of it really does.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not just, the archive, but actual books. And of course, with Arrowwood hosting the archive eventually, it's going to make a lot of it really accessible, but there's some exciting stories and filling in of the gaps, so to speak.
Wow. It's
Is it-
great.
Mhm.
So the future hopefully will be healthy and sane.
Oh,
That's-
yeah. Well, it's information, right? Education, information. I mean, that's our job, is to put the information out there, and that is the education part of it.
Yeah.
And it's not just important for people planning to be therapists. I'd suggest anybody planning on tripping, period,
Mhm.
whether it's recreational or whether it's therapeutic, should actually start by spending as much time as possible educating themselves.
Absolutely.
Because some
Yeah.
people, especially people who have psychiatric disorders, can actually be worsened.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so it's just, people should be honest with themselves about, what they're embarking on.
Right.
And the only way to do that is with education, because the material does exist.
Mm.
It's just a matter of taking the time to read it.
Mhm.
So somebody who's, to date psychedelic naive, who wants to explore psychedelics, what would be some advice to that person as a first step before tripping?
Read everything they possibly can
Right.
before starting.
Right.
Mhm.
Actually invest the time and get educated on their own.
Yeah.
Mm.
Erowid is an amazing resource.
Mhm.
I mean, just checking that, and yeah.
People who have been diagnosed as schizophrenic should they should not
Mm.
try psychedelics. And it's very important that there are people who should not try them and should not use them. And the only way they are going to realize this is by reading
Mm.
and by asking their friends, the friends who have tripped and who have some knowledge of this area, or ask a therapist.
Mhm.
But it is important that the people who should not use them be aware of that fact.
Mhm.
It's very gratifying to see the rise of community centers where people who are curious or feel that these kinds of experiences could benefit them would actually have the option of being able to just sit down and talk with someone. Someone knowledgeable who's experienced and maybe not a therapist, but just a peer, and sort out what are your intentions, what are your expectations, what would you like to, what do you think you're looking for,
Mhm. Mhm.
and expressing that. Sometimes it's like the process of handwriting notes. There's something about that process that can clarify things a lot.
Mhm.
What places are available for people?
Well, we just heard of a center in Berkeley that's
Yep.
starting up, and I can't imagine that they're not going to proliferate.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah.
Good.
Brand new psychedelic community center that just opened in Berkeley. And Peach is sort of a concept that I've been playing around with.
Okay.
Which I think the concept of Peach will certainly be furthered in a community center like this. And I hope that they replicate. I think that if we can make it work here in the Bay, the Bay is always like kind of a place where things start and then get replicated. So if we can really make it work here, I think it can really ripple out in a significant way. And I'm excited at the prospect of that kind of thing.
Wendy's father, Dr. John Perry, had a wonderful concept of what he called diabasis,
Mhm.
which never came to pass. And I hope someday somebody is going to pick up that idea and have a diabasis center,
Mhm.
which is very much along the lines you should be describing.
What is that? Yeah, what does that concept mean?
It was a place that he established in San Francisco. It existed for a while until funding ran out with, I think it was Reagan who got in, dried up funding for mental health.
Yeah.
But it was a place for people to go in their first schizophrenic break before they were medicated, very important, before medication. And they could be there and go through their process, because he had discovered that there was a very similar process that people would go through in being schizophrenic. It was like the psyche breaking apart and needing to come back together again. And if
young adults.
yeah,
mostly.
and if you allowed that process to happen, it would give that support to it. But if you medicated, that process was just, and it stopped. Yeah.
But yeah, very good.
It was the breakthrough of a spiritual process that wanted to happen. Yeah, it was a very, very good idea.
That sounds similar to the wrong-minded idea of people having psychedelic crisis and shutting it down with hardcore tranquilizers,
Exactly.
rather than helping the person get through it and integrate things.
Precisely.
Yeah. And that gets to just the even broader cultural issue we have, right? Where our culture doesn't understand even this concept of a spiritual emergence. All we can see, even the idea of the pathology of schizophrenia, we just label it as, oh, this is a bad thing, this is schizophrenia, then you have a problem. And our culture, by and large, doesn't have a lot of capacity to acknowledge, like, wait, maybe this is actually an emergence. Maybe there's, we don't have the support to hold that. And maybe, you know, in some cultures, right, someone having what we call schizophrenia might be considered in another culture, someone who's a shaman.
Yeah,
visionary. Yeah.
Well, that was the idea behind Dr. Stan Groff's the Spiritual Emergence Network.
That's right.
Was exactly that idea. I think that is still successful. That still exists as far as I know.
And you can extrapolate this to other types of what we would call mental health conditions. By default, someone operates in a way that isn't normal, whatever that means. What's our go-to thing? Well, we put them in a psych ward, we give them a lot of meds, and we only, in this culture, the only way we can engage with mental states that are not normal is pathologize it and try to suppress it.
Try to fix it.
Try to fix it. And to develop this kind of container, though, right? Like, maybe we can engage with these in another way. That's, oh, maybe there's something here. So that would be really amazing if we could see that sort of a center and mentality more broadly to emerge.
Yeah, and there are so many young boys who with the change in their metabolism, in their hormones, at around age 14 or so, can have what looks like breakdowns, and those should be handled not by over medicating, but in therapy.
Right. And we over medicate everything, and we will call it, oh, you have ADHD, and we're gonna give you stimulants. And how many people, you know, and if we have, I don't know what % of people are being prescribed stimulants as adolescents now, but, you know, maybe we should consider the problem isn't in the individuals, it's in the system and the containers that we have. But that is, of course, isn't, it seems obvious to me, but it's not obvious within the current culture.
Yeah.
By the opposite token, there are ADHD patients who, in fact, are remarkably helped by stimulants.
For sure.
You know, but we don't like one size fits all solutions.
Yeah, exactly.
It seems like if there's a way to support whatever's happening, and then if that's not working, then you go to the next thing, which might be medication. But just that whole idea of supporting some process that somebody's going through, that's what's not happening. It just goes right to trying to fix it. Quick fix.
Right.
Yeah. And if we talk about, you know, the nature of drugs here, right, and what's the relationship to drugs, it seems like in the current culture, the relationship to drugs is either, well, this is bad, never do it, or hey, everyone needs to be on this drug. And we have this very immature relationship to drugs. So I don't know, maybe this is an interesting question. Like, how would a mature culture interface with drugs?
Mhm.
Yeah, well,
Well, Sasha always said that he was creating tools to explore the mind. So if we look more broadly at drugs as an aspect of society, learning how to use them as tools, well, we have a lot of problems. Profit motive, pricing, distribution. We have a lot of issues in managing drugs going forward.
And also the insistence by FDA on the use of pure molecules rather than plants.
Oh.
You know, that to me seems rather backwards because plants are easy to grow. They're easy for people to use. And the idea that you should rely on pure molecules rather than a plant that actually has a sort of symphony or entourage effect. You know, they've been used safely for eons.
Mhm. Mhm.
Well, there was that.
there's a big argument on that.
What's that?
Which is the best, the plant or the synthetic in the lab, and that's an argument which has not been solved.
Not in the last 40 years anyway.
No.
And yet, you know, if you were to take, say, for example, mescaline, and you had pure synthetic mescaline and pure mescaline derived from a plant, if you could tell, if anybody can tell any difference between them, it's because one of them wasn't purified. If they're actually purified, they're the same molecule, it's the same experience, and it's something anybody could actually prove to themselves just by comparing them, you know, if they had access to the molecules.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Yeah, it's kind of a philosophical question at a certain point, but we know from practitioners or users of different plant medicines that there are notable differences between different species and varieties, and you know, even under different growth conditions. So it becomes kind of a devotion to learn how to use plant medicines, and you know, the lucky ones who persist can develop kind of an alliance with the plants they grow, which is a lovely thing, and I think can provide a lot of spiritual solace. But it's hard to do on an apartment balcony.
Well, I've heard there are people who say that taking a material of any kind, if it was made by Shulgin, gave them a much better experience than one made by another chemist.
This goes to expectation.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think I recall Sasha saying about this whole controversy of natural versus synthetic, that, well, I make these things and I'm natural, so how are these not natural?
Exactly.
All the components that go in are natural. They're all just elements, right?
Right, right. And we're all, you know, made of star stuff that was exploded out in the galaxy a zillion years ago. So
Precisely.
You know, I especially like Sasha's image of him being an artist who basically creates with atoms.
Yeah. And molecules.
I've been thinking about that over the weekend with all the discussion of Sasha and his impact. And, you know, to say, oh, Sasha was a chemist, it's kind of like saying, oh, well, Bob Dylan was a songwriter or Mozart was a composer. You know, it just really doesn't penetrate to the real nature of the thing.
Yeah.
So too, Paul, I would like you to kind of give a little, give people a snapshot of what, how you're continuing the legacy, the work.
Great. Well, Sasha, as probably everyone knows, never really had intentions of creating a business or a commercial enterprise around his work. He coined an operation that he called the Alexander Shulgin Research Institute back in the 80s. I think maybe I'm a little inaccurate here, but, you know, kind of to create an institutional wrapper around his work so that some of the members of the research group who really had credentials could act in a way analogous to an institutional review board at, like a medical university or whatever. But in any event, when Sasha passed, I think we collectively looked at the body of his work and what was left to be explored, and realized we really wanted to see collectively some mechanism to take things forward. So Nick Cozy and I have been publishing together for years. And this last summer published a paper on synthesis and characterization of high purity DMT hemifumarate for clinical applications. And I guess just as the zeitgeist was turning at that moment, we started to get inquiries from other researchers and from venture capitalists. And so we talked it over, and after a lot of soul searching about the nature of what we wanted to do, we have incorporated the Alexander Shulgin Research Institute. It's a straight C corporation, which means it's a for-profit entity. And we're in the process of creating a small pharmaceutical research and development unit focused on extending and proliferating psychedelic compounds in much the manner that Sasha did.
Great.
As part of that, again, we all know this strange thing we have called capitalism does demand that there be intellectual property that can be protected and developed. So we see a few prongs of work. One would be creation of new compounds that would be new intellectual property, new matter, new entity, chemical entities. But we also, I kind of kiddingly refer to this as drug rehabilitation. Sasha created a lot of compounds. The ones that are in TCAL and PCAL are not all of them. There are a handful that were never published, never really characterized very well. And actually, most of his early work included compounds that have never been subject to the kinds of both physiological and pharmacological characterization that's now kind of standard for new substances. So, how do they interact with receptors? We now have much more effective and economical small animal models that give us an inkling as to what the behavioral effects might be. And so we've started to have meetings with both academics and companies that provide those kinds of services. And we've met with a lot of folks opening up new companies focused on psychedelics.
Great.
We think we have a kind of a unique position of having this fabulous palette of Sasha's work as a foundation. So in the last few months, I've been spending a lot of time cataloging and collecting all the samples, and they are kind of splattered around here, that Sasha left us. And there are at least on the order of about 500 finished compounds, which means that they've been taken to a synthesis endpoint. There's a block of probably a comparable number, maybe a bit more, of his very early work, which predated his work on psychedelics, that we're conserving, but we probably will not really pursue immediately because they're chemistries that have nothing to do with psychedelics. But there's also a large block of compounds that are intermediates, precursors, compounds that are on their way to becoming psychedelic. So we know what, we can go back and interpret from his work what he made from them, but we also may divert them into new structures. So
there's a lot of work to do.
those are kind of the two main prongs. And then I'm an analytical guy, so I'm interested in plant chemistry and have been since before Sasha and I ever met. So we're going to try to take a stab at the entourage effect in cactus and other plants that look like they may have beneficial uses that haven't been studied so much. So between that and having some educational outreach and talking to as many people we can about the value of this work, that'll keep us busy for a few years.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, so please stay tuned.
Oh, that's good to hear. Are we almost at the end?
We're close, yeah. So, well, do you have any final kind of words of wisdom that you'd like to?
No, but I have some word of thanks, which I would like to give.
And I will after.
I want to say something about some people who are important in my life, as they were in Sasha's, and to thank them. First, Tanya Manning, who is my best friend and my beloved companion, and her husband, Greg, who fixes things that need to be fixed. He also researches things that need researching, which is a lot. And when Sasha or I had financial problems, Greg was great at fundraising and got us out of many difficult spots. Finally, I want to thank my two Tibetan caregivers, Di Chen and Chimmy, who have been taking care of me for over 10 years. I would not be as happy and healthy as I am without their loving care.
And I'd like to say that I would like to mention that Tanya couldn't be here this evening. We had hoped that she could, but she's with a friend who's dying right now and with their family, and she's being a great support to them. And Tanya's been an intrinsic part of all the goings on at the farm for it's been over 15 years, and her help and her work around here is invaluable.
And Greg has too.
And Greg too.
Yeah.
She took over for me when I left. I was Sasha's assistant for 13 years, and I left and went and got married and started a new life. And she took over for me when I left. And she has, she's done a lot of work on the archive in the beginning of that process. She co-authored the book with Paul and with Sasha, the Shulgin Index. And she always has her eye on the big picture of what's going on everywhere. She's just a great help and a valuable asset to everything that's going on here. And she's got such a generous spirit, and we really appreciate her help and her being here.
I'm sorry she had to be away.
And I would also really like to personally thank Synergetic Press, Deborah and Doug and Amanda and Jasmine, and making this alliance, Transform Press, coming together with Synergetic Press has been unbelievable. It's really enabled all this to happen. It's Transform Press is it's been going for a long time, but it just needed that help and that infrastructure and that energy. And they've brought so much energy to the publishing and so many great ideas. And I'm just so grateful for all of their help and their enthusiasm about all there is to do. So, and Trout again. Without the work on the nature of drugs that you've been doing, wouldn't be here. So thank you for all that.
So a lot of people that have been involved.
Yeah.
I mean, even with archiving.
Yes.
I'd mentioned Tanya. I wouldn't have become involved with the archiving if it hadn't been for Tanya, if it hadn't been for the Arrowwoods, and of course, if it hadn't been for Sasha. And then, there's people like Scott Bordarchy digging just mountains of material out of the barn and sort of unearthing parts of the archive, and Mark Martini doing early fundraising. And it's, I'm sure we're forgetting people because there's just been so many people involved with this and actually making it work. It's just almost been like a magical process.
A big team effort, that is
Yeah,
for
it's-
sure. It's
it's
a
a
lot of
team.
work.
Yeah.
It really is a
A
team,
lot of work.
a bunch of good people.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And we keep going.
Yes. Still more to do.
Yeah, always.
Well, I've said the great thing for sort of future history and understanding what all went on here is that Shulgin's never threw anything away. Of course, the bad thing, they never threw anything away.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So we continue to find eye-popping new information and treasures of all sorts. It just doesn't stop.
It's almost every day of scanning, in fact.
Yeah.
Some new surprise or treasure.
Mm.
I mean, today, yesterday, the day before,
Right.
it's just mind-boggling.
Mm.
So thank you, Anne, and thank you, Sasha,
Yeah.
for letting us into your lives.
Thanks to Sasha.
Thank you
Yeah.
for my life.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Oh,
You're
that.
welcome. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, big thanks. I have a lot of things to give. I mean, thanks everyone watching. Thank you all here. This has been actually a great day for me. I'm honored to be here on this farm talking with you. And
What is that interesting thing there?
this is Peter's coming back on.
Oh, okay.
But I'll say also thank you so much, Anne, to you and to Sasha, for all of your pioneering work and the bravery and courage it took. Actually, you did things that people hadn't done. You blazed trails, and your shoulders are the ones that myself and other young and up and coming psychedelic activists and drug policy reformers, we stand on your shoulders.
That's why I've been having such pain.
I'm sorry about that. Thank you, though. You gave us a boost, and
Now I understand.
yeah, apologies for that. But truly, thank you for all of that pioneering work.
You're welcome. Okay.
Well, we've felt incredibly blessed here at City Lights and greatly honored to be part of this. And I'd like to thank everybody. This wraps up what has been just an amazing weekend. The turnout has been fantastic. People's responses to these sessions have been overwhelmingly positive. We've enjoyed the proceedings as much as you have. And we really look forward to hosting more events like this in the future. City Lights' commitment to continuing to feature books exploring psychedelic experience and consciousness studies continues into the future. And as we now again begin to open to the public, we invite everyone to please come on down to the store, check out our stock. As I mentioned earlier in these proceedings, we were one of the first places in the Bay Area that began carrying books of this sort. Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception way back in the day, and now featuring this wonderful book, The Nature of Drugs, and looking forward to the future volume. Our heartfelt thanks once again to our friends at Transform Press, Wendy, also Synergetic Press, Deborah, Sandy, for keeping us in your orbit and for involving us in this remarkable and historic event. Also really want to thank all of our sponsors. And last but not least, City Lights would like to send our love and gratitude to Anne for all the important work you have done and continue to do. We are grateful that you have brought us into your orbit. This has been a very deeply moving and stimulating weekend. We hope we can do justice to the work that you have set into motion and to keep the faith. So thank you. And thanks everyone for joining us. Please be well, be safe. We hope to see you all again very soon. I will leave the last word with Anne, actually.
Good heavens. Oh, wait, what's that?
I want to say that people should send City Lights Books some
Oh,
gifts
yes.
of support, because they have done a great service in putting
Yes,
this
please
conference
support
on.
the City Lights book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter, so much.
Thank you.
We should also say thanks to John Hanna. for all
Oh,
of, all
John
of his
Hanna.
amazing input.
Yes, John Hanna has been an amazing help so much with the commemorative edition. It's just, he's doing a lot of work and he's really good at what he does. So thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
We have so many people, it's
I
it's
know.
hard to remember everybody in one sitting.
True.
Yeah, right.
And thank you, Mike.
Thank you,
It's
Mike.
been my privilege to be here today.
Tell us when we're off.
Yeah, I
So, happy trails to you until we meet again.
thank you all for tuning in. May the force be with you.
Yeah.